At a high-risk UN gathering in New York, Turkey's defense minister Yaşar Güler delivered a message that landed like a thunderclap in Moscow. Crimea is not Russia's, and never will be. Ankara has never recognized the 2014 annexation, Güler said, and Turkey remained committed to Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity, Crimea included. It was not a quiet note in a corridor. It was a public declaration, delivered in front of dozens of world leaders, aimed squarely at the heart of Vladimir Putin's imperial narrative. The timing and the setting were deliberate. The remarks came alongside the fifth meeting of the Crimea Platform, held at the United Nations. There, more than 50 countries, including the United States, the United Kingdom, and France, signed a New York declaration calling for tighter penalties on those aiding Russia's occupation and more scrutiny of human rights violations in the peninsula. For the Kremlin, a lone critic can be ignored. A bloc of 50 nations cannot. This is where Turkey's position matters. Ankara is a NATO member with deep ties across the Black Sea and the Middle East, a country that sells advanced drones to Ukraine and buys vast quantities of energy from Russia. It is a bridge, a broker, and at times a spoiler. When it speaks, the region listens. And when its defense minister frames Crimea's status as non-negotiable, the signal is unmistakable. Turkey is aligning itself openly and repeatedly on Kiev's side on the core issue of this war. Behind the diplomacy is a human story Turkey knows well. Güler used his UN platform to highlight the plight of the Crimean Tatars, a Turkic Muslim community with centuries-deep cultural ties to Anatolia. For Ankara, supporting them is not just foreign policy. It is a moral obligation rooted in history and identity. Turkish officials have repeatedly condemned arrests, school closures, and what they call politicized prosecutions targeting Tatar activists. In Turkish politics, this resonates. It's not only about borders on a map, it's about who gets to live, speak, and worship freely on that map. Yet Turkey's stance is also strategic. Control of Crimea shapes military logistics, grain flows, energy routes, and naval reach across the Black Sea. Sevastopol is not merely a harbor, it is a launch pad. If Russia holds it uncontested, Kiev's maritime options shrink and NATO's southern flank feels the pressure. If Ukraine erodes Russia's grip, the chessboard changes for ports, pipelines, and patrol route from the Bosphorus to the eastern Mediterranean. To understand why Ankara keeps returning to Crimea, you have to zoom out. The Turkish-Russian rivalry spans centuries. The Ottoman Empire and the Russian Empire fought repeated wars over influence from the Balkans to the Caucasus. In 1783, Catherine the Great's forces seized Crimea, turning it into a forward base that threatened Ottoman shipping and Istanbul's security. The Crimean War of the 1850s, where Britain, France, and Sardinia fought alongside the Ottomans, etched into memory just how decisive that peninsula can be. Those old contours still inform today's instincts in Ankara and Moscow. The Tatar dimension deepens those instincts. Under Stalin in 1944, nearly 200,000 Crimean Tatars were deported to Central Asia, accused of collaboration even as many had served in the Red Army. Thousands died in transit or exile. Their language, religion, and culture were suppressed for decades. For modern Turkey, that trauma is not abstract. Tatar families and associations in Anatolia keep it alive through stories, memorials, and activism. When Turkish leaders speak of moral duty, it is more than rhetoric. All of this helps explain why Ankara can disagree with Moscow and Crimea while still managing an intricate relationship elsewhere. Turkey bought Russia's S-400A defense system in 2017, defying Washington and sacrificing its place in the F-35 program. Russian tourists bring billions into Turkey's economy. Russian oil and gas still power Turkish industry and homes. At the same time, Turkey has sold Bayraktar TB2 drones to Ukraine, backed grain export corridors through the Bosphorus, and tightened cooperation with NATO allies in the Black Sea. It is adaptive opportunism, working with Russia where useful, hedging against it where necessary. The balancing act has grown harder. A proposed Russian gas hub in Turkey, floated in 2022 as a workaround to sanctions, has quietly withered amid frictions. Ankara has expanded non-Russian energy options, increasing flows from the South Caucasus and the Caspian to reduce dependence. Trade remains strong, but it is no longer a one-way street. Turkey wants choice, leverage, and flexibility, and Crimea sits at the intersection of all three. Economically, the Black Sea is a superhighway. Before the war, Ukraine's port shipped tens of millions of tons of grain to global markets. The closure or blockade of those routes pushes up food prices in Cairo, Karachi, and beyond. Energy cables, pipelines, and future gas fields raise the stakes further. Turkey's control of the straits under the Montreux Convention gives Ankara a unique tool. In times of crisis, it decides which warships can pass. In 2022, it used that authority to restrict naval traffic, limiting escalation while keeping lifelines open for commerce. Militarily, the war is eroding Russia's sense of impunity in Crimea. Ukrainian long-range strikes have hit airfields, depots, and command nodes. Russia has repositioned assets and reinforced defenses. Open-source imagery shows disruptions in flight activity and damaged facilities. Kiev's goal is not only symbolic. It's to make Crimea costly to occupy and harder to use as a staging ground. For Turkey, every Russian setback in Crimea slightly reduces the risk envelope around the straits and the coast, while increasing Ankara's leverage as a mediator or guarantor. This is where today's headline question comes into play. Will Turkish troops head to Ukraine? Officially, Ankara's language is focused on sovereignty, diplomacy, and humanitarian concerns, especially for the Tatars, not on sending combat forces to fight Russia. But conversations about peacekeeping or monitoring a ceasefire surface whenever the conflict's endgame is discussed. If there were a deal that required credible observers or security guarantees, Turkey, NATO member, Black Sea power, historic stakeholder, would be on the short list of candidates. That possibility carries risks and advantages. A Turkish presence, framed as peacekeeping under a UN or multinational mandate, could stabilize corridors, verify withdrawals, or protect civilians, including Tatar communities. It could also anger Moscow, complicate energy ties, or draw Turkey into frontline frictions. Ankara knows this. Its entire approach since 2022 has been to maximize influence while minimizing irreversible commitments. Mid-video question for you. If Ankara were asked tomorrow to send Turkish troops as neutral peacekeepers to supervise a Crimea ceasefire, would you support it, knowing it could shorten the war but also risk a direct clash with Russia? Tell us where you stand and why. Back to the map. Sevastopol remains a core of Russia's Black Sea Fleet, a fleet that has suffered real losses since 2022. Even as Moscow pours billions into modernization, strikes and sabotage have chipped away at ships and infrastructure. Ukraine's own navy is small, but its evolving drone and missile tactics have turned the coastline into a contested space. For Turkey, that contest underscores a strategic truth. Whoever sets the rules in the Black Sea shapes the Mediterranean and parts of the Middle East. This is why Ankara has guarded the grain deal framework so fiercely. When Russia suspended participation, Turkey worked to revive or replicate the corridors, knowing what a shut gate does to global prices and political stability. It's also why Turkey has invested in surveillance, patrols, and partnerships along the western Black Sea with Romania and Bulgaria. Every interdicted smuggling vessel, every cleared minefield, reduces the risk of wider escalation and keeps trade moving. Zoom in on the numbers, and the stakes sharpen. The Bosphorus and Dardanelles handle roughly 40,000 ship transits a year. Black Sea Energy Project could yield tens of billions of cubic meters of gas by 2030. Russian hydrocarbons transiting Turkish hubs feed Europe's grids even as the EU tries to diversify. Maritime insurance premiums spike when ports are threatened. Food inflation rises when grain is trapped. Political unrest follows rising costs. All of these trends cross Turkish airspace and Turkish waters. Diplomatically, Ankara is leveraging that centrality. It talks to Washington and Brussels about airframes and sanctions relief. It speaks to Moscow about energy in Syria. It engages Kiev about drones and reconstruction contracts. European funding for Turkish ports and logistics reflects a clear calculation. Keeping Turkey inside the tent on trade and transport is cheaper than dealing with a crisis if those arteries clog. The message from Brussels is pragmatic. We need you, and Ankara knows it. Domestic politics play into this. 2. Support for the Tatars and a firm line on Crimea fit President Erdogan's projection of strength and guardianship. Protector of Turkey peoples, defender of national interests, negotiator who can stare down Moscow when necessary and deal when useful. That image has political value at home, where voters weigh pride and prosperity alongside security. A steady hand on the Black Sea reinforces all three. On the ground, or rather, on the water, the battlefield is dynamic. Ukraine is probing deeper. Russia is digging in harder. Supply routes shift. Air defenses adapt. The longer the war drags on, the more both sides will test Crimea's defenses and the more the question of the peninsula's future will dominate diplomacy. Any discussion of ceasefires, frozen lines, or eventual settlements will collide with Crimea's status first. Where does that leave Turkey? In a place of unusual leverage. It can facilitate talks, police corridors, or, if the stars align, contribute to a multinational monitoring force. It can keep the straits open for grain and closed to escalation. It can tilt energy flows and set rules for maritime traffic. And it can continue to champion the rights of the Tatars, putting a human face on a geopolitical struggle too often reduced to maps and missiles. None of this means Turkish combat brigades are about to march into the Donbass. It does mean Ankara will shape whatever comes next, by what it allows through the straits, by which deals it brokers, by which red lines it chooses to enforce. If a credible ceasefire framework emerges, expect Turkey to push for mechanisms that protect civilians, safeguard trade, and prevent Crimea from becoming a permanent launching pad for future wars. For Russia, that's a problem. The narrative that Crimea is forever Russian collides with a regional reality in which Turkey is stronger, more connected, and more assertive than a decade ago. For Ukraine, it's an opportunity. Turkish technology, diplomacy, and geography, combined with Western weapons and Kiev resilience, create a multi-layered pressure campaign on the occupation. For Europe, it's insurance. A stable, engaged Turkey reduces the odds of food shocks, energy crises, and naval incidents spilling into the Mediterranean. In short, the question in our title isn't only about boots on the ground. It's about whether Turkey is prepared to convert words into mechanisms, patrols, monitors, corridors, inspections that change realities on the ground and at sea. The answer so far, Ankara is already doing some of that, and it is preparing to do more when the moment comes. If Ukraine advances, Turkey becomes an indispensable bridge for reconstruction, ports, rails, energy grids, linking Kiev to the Mediterranean and beyond. If Russia holds, Turkey remains a pivotal gatekeeper to the Black Sea, a power that never fully aligned with Moscow and never abandoned Kiev. Either way, Turkey's voice will carry more weight in NATO councils, UN corridors, and European boardrooms. Crimea, then, is more than a peninsula. It's a pressure valve for global grain, a hinge for naval power, a test of international law, and a mirror for Turkey's evolving identity. No longer just a bridge between East and West, but a guardian of the world's narrowest choke point. That is why Ankara keeps repeating, in every forum it can, Crimea is Ukraine. And that is why any credible endgame to this war will have to pass, one way or another, through Turkish hands. So, will Turkish troops head to Ukraine? Not to wage war. If they go, it would be to police a peace. The more immediate truth is already visible. Turkey is moving the pieces that matter: grain, gas, ships, and diplomacy. In a conflict where geography is destiny, Ankara sits where the map narrows and the stakes rise. And from that narrow strait, it can do what few others can: lower the temperature, open the lanes, and make sure the next chapter in the Black Sea is written with few missiles and more rules.